Good morning, and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you for coming in on a somewhat gloomy, overcast Washington fall morning. And for those of you joining us on the internet via webcast, thanks for tuning in. My name is Kevin Book, and I'm a senior associate in the Energy and National Security Program here. I also am a research analyst at Clearview Energy Partners, where some of you may know me. And today we're going to have the pleasure of hearing from the International Energy Agency in a full discussion of the Renewable Energy Market Report for 2017, which is a 5-year outlook. I'm going to get started by giving a few framing remarks, and then I will introduce our featured speaker. Then I will ask our featured speaker a few questions, and then we'll take, hopefully, a very lively set of questions from the audience. As an analyst, I think about the world maybe a little differently than people. I think people who aren't analysts sometimes think about the world generationally, and the unit of a generation is about 20 years. So 2 generations have come between the Arab oil embargo and the present era of energy, what I'd call adequacy, rather than maybe abundance. As an analyst, though, I think it's often useful to think in terms of 1, 5, and 10-year intervals. So to the extent that the vastness of the world's energy infrastructure, more than 6 terawatts of generating capacity exists, 1 year isn't enough to change very much. 5 years is an investment cycle, and 10 years is 5 investment cycles, if you think about it, which can be enough for things to change utterly. So thinking back 10 years ago, as an analyst serving financial investors, it was often the case that people weren't talking as much about renewables so much as another resource. It was the gap, the perceived gap between economic growth in the world and the scarcity of transportation fuels, and oil especially, that drove a lot of discussion. Now, there were some fringes that were very focused on things like biofuels and fast-growing solar stocks. But today, it would be hard to find a graduate student of energy policy who would prefer to talk about oil rather than renewables. Renewables have grown from a small base very rapidly to the point where they're starting to reach, I think, into adulthood, or at least a very prominent adolescence. As far as those of you who like to mark eras in different ways, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Adam Szyminski, my colleague here, who has used energy-themed covers from The Economist magazine to indicate eras. For any of you who have seen this incredibly entertaining and insightful presentation Adam puts out, it is as respectful and respectable as you might imagine Adam would be. I use a slightly different marker, being slightly different from Adam, which would be Matt Damon movies about energy. Admittedly, I only have 2 data points. The 2005 Matt Damon movie, Syriana, treated international intrigue surrounding the oil market. The 2012 Matt Damon movie about energy, The Promised Land, treated a more local form of intrigue about the benefits and costs of hydraulic fracturing. Extending 7 years forward from 2012, perhaps in 2019, there will be yet another Matt Damon movie, and perhaps it will be about renewable energy this time. But to look ahead, we need an expert, not Matt Damon. So having introduced the Damon marker, I would now take an opportunity to introduce Heymi Bahar. Heymi is he's the project manager for the report you're going to hear about today at the International Energy Agency. But his background goes a lot deeper than that. He's a trade specialist, an energy specialist. He's worked at the OECD, and he's very familiar with this neighborhood. As a graduate of the CSIS program at Hopkins. And so I'm going to turn it over to him for a very thorough exposition of his work, and we'll look forward to a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for comparing with Matt Damon, so it's not very... Anyway, so thank you very much for the invitation and organizing this event. When I basically contacted CSIS for this, I realized that all our market reports are presented here, and except renewables. So this will be the first time that we are presenting renewables in addition to gas, coal, and I think oil as well, and the long-term on world energy outlook. I just want to start with an important, before going into the presentation, important general drivers of renewables. There are three important ones. One is obviously the climate change. We have a situation that the climate is, the world is warming up. There are effects in many ways, and climate change is an important driver for what we are trying to achieve, and renewables have a role to play in this. The second one is energy access. 1.2 billion people have no access to electricity in the world, and it's one of the biggest challenge of the energy world. And the third one is air pollution. Our report estimated that there are a lot of people are dying prematurely from air pollution, and this is also another challenge. And we try to understand renewables and renewable forecast and how they can contribute to these challenges, to meet those challenges. And I'm going to go back to those challenges over my presentation. But let me start with 2016. What happened in 2016 in the renewables world? It's been 6 years that we are announcing new records for renewables. Last year, this report said that renewable capacity additions represented about 50% or just over 50% of all total capacity additions in 2015. This is what we announced last year. And with this, renewables in terms of total capacity surpassed coal. It was a big deal. We announced this, and then it was everywhere. This year, this 50% moved to 2/3. So renewables actually represented 2/3 of all capacity additions globally in 2016. These are the other fuels. What happened is that coal was the first one, again, in terms of total installations. However, there is one star of 2016 is solar PV. Its capacity increased by 50% in just 1 year, from 50 gigawatts to 75 gigawatts almost. This is due to China. I'll come back to China later on in my presentation. But when you take into account the retirements of these plants, which is this, actually for the first time in our history, a renewable technology, which is solar PV, led the total capacity growth globally. Hydro did not do this before. Wind did not do this before. For the first time, solar PV was the largest additions among all renewables, also the largest addition in terms of the whole global power fleet, in terms of net capacity. So this is an incredible record, and you will see that in my presentation, this trend will continue. So when we look at the renewables and what is driving renewables, I mentioned these three overarching policy challenges, or I would say energy policy challenges. However, there are policies that are designed to meet those challenges and to basically promote renewables around the world. And we looked at what are those policies. The success of renewables obviously came from policy support, initially in Europe, creating a demand for these technologies which were more expensive than compared to others, through long-term contracts, feed-in tariffs, feed-in premiums, and various other policy measures like tax incentives or grants to make them competitive within the other fuels. However, the policies are changing as well. In 2016, only 20% of renewable policies that basically decided what renewables will get in terms of remuneration competitively. The 80% was administratively set, which means that the governments are setting the price to buy renewable power. In the future, the policies are changing from becoming an enabler to a facilitator, which means that now costs are come down, which I will show very soon after this slide. In the coming 5 years, we expect renewable capacity growth globally, 50% of it, to come from competitively price setting mechanism. What is this? Which means that governments open an auction or tender, and developers apply for it, and then there's a competition to define what is the price. When you exclude China from this picture, which has still administratively set prices for renewables, the picture is actually two-thirds. Two-thirds of all renewable plants, taking out China, in the world will come from competitive price-setting mechanism. So this is an important trend. As I said, renewable policies are becoming from an enabler to a facilitator, in this case, with decreasing costs. So this is what happened in the cost side. So these little points gives you the auction results globally, averaged by capacity. And you can see that for the first time, solar PV average auction costs were lower than wind in some parts of the world. And we are talking about the 30 cents per, 3 cents per kilowatt hour, or $30 per megawatt hour, which is extremely low. And what is the driver for this? The driver was the competition, because the government started to open competition, as I mentioned, and then the prices went down. However, this does not necessarily mean that this trend will continue, or there's a caveat on this one, because we are basically following all the auction results, and if they will actually be materialized. This is another question. These are just the announcements. But this doesn't change the overall message that competition within the renewable industry is driving the cost down and making their renewable generation costs more comparable to other fuels. We also look at the global average generation cost of different renewables. They are obviously higher than these auction results, because in some markets in the world, still renewables are supported in various incentives. And then, just give you a few examples, China still has high feed-in tariffs for solar PV and wind. United States, you still have tax incentives, which is a little bit more expensive than in other places. And in Japan, which is one of the largest markets, is by its own tax incentive. Overall, as you can see here, that for the first time, solar PV auction results are lower than wind, but when you look at the total generation costs globally, going to the future, solar PV remains more expensive than this. However, one important note, the acceleration of these auctions, according to us, may accelerate overall generation costs as well, as they are offering lower and lower costs. Sorry. So let's look at the forecast by technology. This year, we argued that solar PV is entering into a new era. First reason is the one that I mentioned related to 2016. The second reason, for the first time in our forecast, 5-year forecast, solar PV growth is larger than any other renewable fuel. Not only that, it's also largest growth of any other fuel in the world, capacity growth. I'm not talking about generation. I'll come to generation later on. So this is an important news. Overall, solar PV will be the first capacity additions in the coming 5 years of all fuels. And as you can see, we expect about 925 gigawatts to come online in the coming 5 years. Just to give you an idea of this, this is the global cumulative installed capacity of coal divided by 2, which means half of it, that took about 80 years to install, just to give you a comparison. We also do an accelerated case. This is our main case. We also look at an accelerated case, which looks at the upside. Our accelerated case is this. We look at the policies, we look at the challenges. If countries address those challenges in the short term, we say 12 to 24 months, here is our accelerated case. It's actually is about 1,150 gigawatts, which is led by solar. 60% of it will come, the upside is coming from solar. And with this, we are saying that solar PV is entering into a new era, and which will continue. However, one important note, which I will come back to that later, 80% of the growth that we expect in the coming 5 years is just wind and solar. The rest is all the other renewable technologies. This has obviously implications of grid integration, which I will come back to that later in my presentation. When we look at the regional breakdown of this, so the red bars show you what happened over the last 5 years. China was the leader of renewable growth 5 years ago, followed by European Union, United States, Japan, India, and Brazil. This picture will change in the next 5 years. Here is the next 5 years picture. China remains obviously the undisputed leader of growth. There's no question about that. However, the other markets are changing. We will see a growth decline in the European Union. The United States, despite all the policy uncertainties, which I'm sure we will come back to it during the discussion, is the second largest market in our forecast. It's actually a growing market. And India is the second largest star after China in our forecast this year, because it will almost quadruple its growth in just 5 years. And for the first time, the growth of India in renewable electricity technologies will surpass European Union. This is the first time this will happen in the next 5 years. We also have an accelerated case. I'll come back to that details by region in the accelerated case, but I would like to emphasize 3 main challenges that all these countries in one way or another are facing to deploy renewables. Grid integration, cost of financing. These are 2 most important things, and cost of financing is especially important for developing countries. And the third one is policy and regulatory uncertainty, which still exists in many countries that are affecting the deployment. Our forecast this year is about 12% higher compared to last year, and our enhanced case shows a quarter further growth going forward. Let's talk about China. China is the leader of renewables, is the undisputed leader of renewables, and it will remain undisputed leader of renewables. But I talked about solar PV entering into a new era and China being the largest growth. When you put those things together, you have this picture. You see in the line, China's share in total solar PV manufacturing. It's about half of all total solar PV manufacturing. When you include Chinese companies' investments outside of China, you go beyond 60%. When you include Taiwan into this, you go to 75%. When you include all the Asian countries, you're at 85, 88%. So it's an Asia story. It's a China story, but it's also an Asia story. China's dominance in solar PV manufacturing has been around for some time, as you can see. What has changed last year? It's its share in demand, right here. Right now, China represents 50% of global annual solar PV demand, and 50%, or if you include Chinese companies' investments outside, 60% of global supply, basically. So this is different than before. China's capacity picked up very fast over the last 2 years, local demand. And now we are talking about whatever China does in terms of its renewable policy will have global implications in terms of the volumes, in terms of prices, in terms of the solar PV global market. So let's look at China, where the growth will come from China, which technologies. Obviously, solar PV is also shining in China in terms of the growth market. You will see that these are the cumulative capacity in China. We expect that China, by 2022, will basically more than double its target that it put for 2020. It already surpassed its target this year, just last month, in terms of their capacity, which was 105 gigawatts. It just surpassed that 3 years ahead. And our forecast expects that it will surpass its wind target in 2018, 2019. So we are talking about a country which is overperforming on renewables. It sets a target, it surpasses, and it increases its target. It sets a target, it surpasses. This is the same cycle that we have been seeing over the last few years. Hydropower growth slows down in China because of environmental and social issues, because it's become more expensive to exploit larger sites. And despite grid integration issues, despite curtailment, which is an important challenge in China, which I will come back, wind growth is still very solid, slowly shifting to offshore wind, onshore and offshore wind as well. But there is one important challenge to this forecast. Chinese policy is changing at the same time. That's why I'm saying that it's become very important, but its policy is changing. China has two challenges right now. The first one is the cost of renewables. The renewables are supported by feed-in tariffs, and this exponential growth created a big budget for renewables, but it's also becoming very expensive right now. The second one is grid integration. Last year, China curtailed about 17%, 15 to 17% of wind generation in just 1 year, which means it's not generated. It could have generated, but it couldn't generate due to grid integration issues. So in order to solve these challenges, Chinese policy is changing from a feed-in tariff to a quota system with green certificates. However, the timing of this change is the biggest forecast uncertainty we have. That's why our accelerated case in China is very large for solar PV, because solar PV will be the most affected in this case. If grid integration challenges are met, if policies that support distributed generation are realized, and if the policy transition is smooth from feed-in tariffs to green certificates, we expect Chinese growth to be 25% more than we expect in our main case. United States. So our forecast in the United States remains stable. Actually, we improved our forecast a little bit despite all these policies, because we think that the basic incentives of United States renewable industry remains the same. These are two incentives. One is tax incentives, federal tax incentives. The second one is renewable portfolio standards at the state level. In many states over the last year or so, renewable portfolio standards are either extended or improved to a longer period of time. That's why we actually did not change our forecast that much. However, the annual growth of the renewables will be dependent on the phase out of these tax incentives. As you may remember, they got extended in multi-year for the first time, which was creating a great certainty for investors. And it will basically phase out after 2020. Our wind forecast shows simply that decline in 2021 and 2022, as you can see. And for solar PV, the decline is smoother because the cost reduction potential of solar PV is much larger than wind, according to our opinion, because system costs in the United States is pretty high compared to other countries. We can come back to that later. It's also the distributed generation in the United States, commercial and residential sector is actually, will continue to get certain tax incentives even after the period, which is reflected in our forecast. But this forecast comes with a big but, question mark. Why? Because of the proposed policies, obviously, which are not in our forecast, are uncertainties. And especially two that I would like to highlight, I'm sure we will discuss afterwards. One is the trade policy, energy trade policy overall, the announcements related to import tariffs on solar PV. And the second one is the tax reform. If the tax reform goes on, if the corporate taxes are reduced, which means that there's less tax equity to be monetized and these renewable energy projects will be affected, for sure. The economics is quite simple. So that's why our forecast remains almost the same, actually a little bit more, a little better, but with some downside risk. That's why our accelerated case is very, very small in the United States, especially after the uncertainty over the implementation or existence of CPP, Clean Power Plan. So India, as I mentioned, is the biggest star, and it will remain as the biggest star. We raised two main challenges in India's forecast last year. The first one was the financial health of utilities, which are the off-takers of renewables. There's a step change in India because first, the fact that renewable, especially for solar PV and wind, the costs are coming down. The utilities are realizing that they don't actually have to pay a lot of money for this new energy. And some of the auction results in India, actually, for solar PV and wind, are comparable to coal tariffs right now. So which means that it's a kind of a wake-up call for utilities. Okay, so we said that these were expensive. Now these are cheaper, so we can actually procure them. The second one is an important step change in the Indian government's policies to basically improve the financial health of utilities, the off-takers. So there's something called Uday scheme, basically giving bonds and covering the debts of those utilities, and which actually started to work very well over the last year. That's why we improved our forecast by about 30 to 40% in India last year, because we were seeing those two challenges, very important ones to hamper growth. And as you can see, the majority of the growth will come from solar PV and wind, mostly from solar PV. But there's another policy improvement on wind, which was that Indian government introduced an auction scheme like it did for solar PV, and immediately the prices went down by 30 to 40%. So, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, competition and policies spurring competition became a facilitator and will become facilitated over the next future. But there are still two major challenges in India: grid integration, because there's a weak grid network, and there is still room to improve financial health of utilities. We looked at state by state, according to their solar PV plans and their financial health. 60 to 70% of states that are expected to procure 60 to 70% of the capacity in the coming 5 years are actually medium good financial health. And the rest, 30 to 40%, are actually needs improvement. This is the reflection of our accelerated forecast, mostly from solar PV. European Union, one of the most important regions, at least used to be for renewables, it's changing. It's changing because of a couple of reasons. The first one is that the demand is not there anymore. Electricity demand in Europe, because of efficiency and economic situation, is not growing that fast. Last year, many countries' electricity demand grew just 0.1 to 0.2%. That's it. Efficiency has an important role to play in Europe as well. That's why there is no need for a lot of new capacity in Europe. That's why, as you can see in Germany and United Kingdom, the growth of renewables is changing. It's slowing down. France is different because they did not grow that much in the last 5 years, but now they are picking up with the new policies. But in Europe, policies are changing too. They are changing from what I mentioned, government-set tariffs, to competitive auctions. And with competitive auctions, government can almost 100% control the volumes. You basically announce an auction, you say, I would like 10 gigawatts or 1 gigawatt or 500 megawatt of capacity to be deployed. That's it. You apply for it, you compete. If you win, you build. If you don't win, you don't build. So this is the new policy. That's why our forecast is based on these announcements of auctions, because government puts plans. And some of countries are introduced those auctions to basically reach their 2020 targets, the binding targets. However, obviously, there are uncertainties over the 2030 targets in Europe, which were introduced last year, but still under the target is there. But the legislation who will govern that target is still under discussion. That's why our forecast after 2020, the annual additions are declining because of this. It's based on this policy. Two more important regions, it's Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA. Especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, demand is the main driver there. Different than Europe, there is demand there. The electricity generation capacity is needed. There is more demand coming in many countries. The grid infrastructure is improving. So we have this demand coming up. And there is also need for diversification, either from hydro, which is seasonal, or other fossil fuel technologies, or more expensive ones. We think that this cost reduction trend will finally, or is already coming to Sub-Saharan Africa and also Middle East, which I will show. We expect a significant growth, almost doubling their current capacity with the growth. However, the challenges remain in Africa, obviously, in terms of the grid infrastructure, in terms of the cost of financing and availability of financing, and also the land acquisition issues, and also regulatory uncertainties. That's why our accelerated forecast is almost half of the main case forecast on top, which is mainly based on solar PV and wind. As you can see, the picture is also changing from a hydro-heavy growth to a solar PV and wind growth slowly with the reduction of prices. In Middle East and North Africa, the situation is the same. You have the lowest auction results in this region in the world, in United Arab Emirates, in several other countries. The prices that they achieved is very, very low. However, the implementation of those, or the pace of implementation of those auctions obviously remain our forecast uncertainty, which is reflected in our accelerated case. So, one important point about energy access. For the first time this year, we did a forecast for off-grid applications. So why off-grid is important? It's very small in our forecast in terms of numbers. It's almost negligible. You can't even see in a figure, in a global figure or in a regional figure. It's important because of economic development and bringing electricity to people. We looked at 3 sub-segments of the off-grid. Mini-grids, the industrial application, which means it can be mining industries, or hospitals, or government buildings, or several other industries that you can imagine that are running mainly on diesel generation, which is extremely expensive. And also the small home systems, we call them SHCs, solar home systems, which include a small battery from 8 watts to 100 watts, 8 watts to 100 watts panel, small battery, energy efficient appliances, and plugs to charge your phone, or basically plug in a ventilator, small ventilator. So we expect this capacity to triple in the next 5 years. However, the most dynamic sector in this, although it's not the largest, is the solar home systems. And we forecast that these solar home systems in just 5 years will bring 70 million additional people basic electricity access. This number can sound small, but in terms of economic growth is actually very significant. I'm saying not energy access, I'm saying initial electricity access, because our energy access definition at the IEA is much more wider, which means that you need to have an increasing trend of consumption in order to reach. But in terms of the basic electricity access, this is extremely important. And this is led by India, Bangladesh, and in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We talked about generation, we talked about capacity a lot. How much capacity is going to build, how much investment will go in this country, which technology. But let's look at how much these technologies will generate globally. These are our forecasts for nuclear, natural gas, and coal. They are all growing because electricity demand is growing in the next 5 years. However, the big star of this line is this one. So renewables surpassed natural gas already a few years ago. They came very close in 2016 with the growth of gas in several regions. But in 2022, renewables will represent 30% of global electricity generation. And it's every 1 percentage point growth every year in the next 5 years. This is pretty significant compared to other fuels. Of course, coal remains the largest source of generation in 2022 in our forecast, in our main case forecast. However, the gap that you see between coal and renewables are reduced by half in just 5 years. And according to our long-term scenarios, renewables become the first source of electricity generation before 2030. All this electricity generation and dominance in wind and solar brings an important challenge to electricity power systems, is grid integration. As you can see, these numbers show solar PV and wind share in 2016 in these countries, and Denmark is leading by already 45%. This picture will change significantly as well. As you can see, the shares are growing, which means the challenges are growing as well. I'd like to emphasize an important point. Grid integration of renewables is not a technical issue. It's an economic issue. To integrate these renewables, this is about how much you pay to integrate them. And it has to be in a cost-effective way, obviously. It's not a technical issue. As you can see in this picture, already in Europe, there are many countries who are running high shares of renewables in their systems because they have flexible power systems, and they basically invested in these. Europe will remain the largest in terms of the largest shares, leader in terms of the largest shares of variable renewables, like wind and solar. But as you can see, when you go below, you said China, India, and Brazil are reaching immediately in just 5 years 10 to 11%, which means that this requires an important policy attention. And in order to integrate larger shares of renewables, secure and cost-effective way, you need flexible power systems. You need stronger grids and interconnections. You need more flexible power plants, gas, hydro, or any other power plant that can operate flexibly. Affordable storage. Today is pumped hydro. Tomorrow is batteries, maybe. Not in the next 5 years, but tomorrow beyond that will be probably batteries. And demand-side response. Policy attention should actually focus on these now. I'm going back to my first slide. Policies 1.0 was governments giving money to renewables to create a demand. Policies 2.0 is the spurring competition. Policies 3.0 is including grid integration into the policies, I will say. So we talked about electricity. There are two important sectors that is actually performing worse than electricity sector is transport and heat. So this is our forecast for biofuel production growth in the coming 5 years by ethanol and biodiesel in different regions. Obviously, the leaders are not the United States. It's not the United States in terms of growth anymore. It is Asia. And this is mainly led by or driven by energy security reasons. Asian countries are investing in biofuels because of the energy security reasons, because they have significant imports of oil. And they are trying to change their basically structure in terms of importing less oil and producing biodiesels and ethanol at home. The growth of Brazil is basically driven by already a very advanced biofuels market, driven by important targets and policies, and it's also competitive there. You can switch between gasoline and ethanol in your car in Brazil. And the growth slows down in Europe because of the changing policy environment. And US is slowly hitting the landing ball, and without any additional policies or investment signals, US biofuel production will remain a slow growth market. Advanced biofuels, which attract a lot of attention, but the growth is very small. Although in our forecast they grow by 7-fold in just 5 years, they remain only 1% of global biofuel production. So it's very, very small compared to. This year, for the first time, we looked at electric cars. Everyone thinks that electric cars are renewable, which is not the case, obviously. Electric cars bring incredible benefits for air pollution in the cities, obviously. But it is important that electricity that goes into electric cars are renewable. And compared to electric cars discussion, actually the largest market for electric vehicles are not electric cars. It's the fanciest one, but it's not the largest one. Actually, 2 3-wheelers in China has the largest growth, represent the largest electricity consumption of electric cars today. We are talking about millions of these 2 3-wheelers driven by policies, simply. In Beijing, you are not allowed to use a gasoline motorbike. That's it. So you can just use electric one. As you can see, cars are tiny in terms of electricity consumption. Over the forecast period, we expect this to double, basically, and cars and buses are entering into picture more and more. although electric two, three-wheelers are going as well. And China accounts for the majority of this growth. It's not the United States, it's not Europe. China is basically leading the growth on this one as well. Overall, electricity consumed from electric vehicles will double in just 5 years, but in 2022, they will just represent, or you can say just represent 1% of the global electricity generation, or you can put it that way, that 1% is actually a lot. That's a different way of putting it. 1% is a number, it can be small, but when we saw 1% is actually pretty large number for electric vehicles, sorry. And we also calculated how much of the electricity from electric cars will come from renewables. And in 2022, we estimate that 30% of electricity used in electric cars will come from renewables. Other 70% is majority fossil fuels and nuclear, basically. So let's put biofuels and electric cars into one picture. So this is the consumption, renewable energy consumption from renewable energy consumption for road transport, which means includes biofuels used in road transport and electric vehicles, renewable consumption of electric vehicles. As you can see, biofuels remain the champion or leader of the renewable energy consumption. And electric vehicles overall, including cars and two, three-wheelers, only represent today 4% of all renewable energy transport. In the next 5 years, the picture actually changes, but biofuels remain the largest source of renewable energy consumption in road transport, and electric vehicles will represent 7%. One important note here, we are here talking about renewable energy consumption, not talking about which one is more efficient in terms of their combustion, or the other one is not using combustion. But obviously, electric cars are way more efficient. The kilometers that you can run with the electricity input that you have is much larger. But that's why those shares, if we calculated passenger kilometer driven, it will probably change. But still, in the next 5 years, biofuels remain the largest source. Overall, the share of renewables in road transport only increases, including electric cars, marginally from 4% today and just 5% in 2022, which means that the demand of other sectors are growing. I'm not even talking about, we are talking about road transport here. I'm not even talking about aviation and shipping and freight transport. Those are a completely different story, which biofuels and electricity is not used almost at all. Just last 2 slides on heat. Neglected for many policymakers, unfortunately, but it's actually extremely important in terms of its consumption. And it actually represents important share of basically our total final energy consumption, about 20%. And we expect a growth in this sector, which should be driven by policies, but the challenge remains in the heat sector because it's more diversified. You have buildings, residential buildings, commercial applications, industrial applications where renewable heat technologies cannot actually meet those demands in terms of the heating level. But overall, we expect 24% growth over the next 5 years, led by bioenergy, led by China, led by bioenergy. But also we calculated how much renewable electricity will be used in heat pumps in the heating and cooling sector, which is an important growth driver coming forward, and solar thermal as well. When we look at the countries, we talked about a gloomy picture on electricity in Europe, but for heat is actually, Europe is leading the world still. This is the share of renewables in the heat demand by region or by country. European Union leads the way because it had a strong policy incentives with 2020 targets. US renewable share is increasing, mostly use of bioenergy and solar thermal in the system. India's share is actually decreasing because of renewables growth cannot keep up with the demand, industrial demand and residential demand that India has. China has the lowest share of renewables, but it's the largest growth in terms of absolute renewable heat growth, but its share only increases to 5% in just 5 years. Overall, renewables in the heat consumption, their share will only increase by 2% in just 5 years. So we talked about electricity, 24 to 30%, transport, 4 to 5%, and heat, 9 to 11%. So there's a long way to go to decarbonize transport and heat. These are some concluding remarks. We expect renewable electricity capacity to grow by 1 terawatt or 1,000 gigawatts, equal to half of the global total capacity, as I mentioned. Renewable generation exceeds in 2022 8,000 terawatt hours. Just to give you an idea, this is a combined electricity consumption of China, India, and Germany. It's quite big in terms of what we are talking about. Solar PV enters into a new era, and the key to this era is held by China in terms of both its impact on demand and supply. Despite rapid growth of electric vehicles, decarbonization of transport remains an important challenge. If we want to achieve 2 degrees target that we have been talking about, we really, really need to tackle challenges in transport and heat sectors. Only 30% of electricity EVs are sourced from renewables. Advanced biofuels require specific incentive to bolster deployment. They are very, very small right now. And finally, we need to, or policymakers need to turn their attention into system integration of renewables and expanding the use of renewables for heating and cooling. On this note, thank you very much for listening, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Would you hit the red button? So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask a few questions. First, I just want to appreciate the enormity of what we've just seen. We've seen the whole world of renewables in a compact and fact-filled, manageable number of slides. Thank you for all of those things. And it's obviously a lot of work to project forward. The challenge, I think Heymi's made it somewhat clear that understanding the key driver in projecting is always the big issue. Anyone can extrapolate numbers on a page, but to get to the bottom of what's moving things is the essence of having an estimate that's right in the future. And the dynamic that you heard about was a sort of governments moving to just creating demand, paying into the renewables market through a variety of financing mechanisms, to fostering competition. And you outlined a challenge of grid integration as sort of the next phase of policy and how it matures and how it factors into estimates. And over again, you mentioned grid integration as a challenge. You also showed the rather spectacular example of Denmark, which is all the way at the far end of renewable penetration in its power sector, and the rest of the world, which has to figure out how to get between here and there. And then you added that it really wasn't a technological challenge so much as an economic one. Is what you're saying, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, is what you're saying that the grid integration problem means that renewables will become more expensive, or does it mean that there's another way to get there?
So the technologies for grid integration, when I say it's not a technical challenge, it's an economic challenge, because the battery technology is expensive. You can just deploy them, and then large scale, and then you can just simply have backup for renewables. But the important thing is that, of course, there is cost to this, to integrate them. There is cost to build grids, but these costs will be there regardless of other plants are added as well. The important thing here is to manage the variability of renewables, because they are based on the weather conditions, obviously. And then the policies need to take into account this new phenomenon, which is different, which is not based on you just not turn on the button and then the power plant will work. So that's why it's a combination of flexible power systems, investing in those. In this case, natural gas is a very flexible one, or making coal plants more flexible, like China is trying to do right now, making them more flexible, or new nuclear technologies, which is becoming more flexible. And basically taking into account embedding these policies, which means that When you basically build a new power plant, you don't just look for electricity. You have to look for its value. What I mean by value, when and where it is generated. This is the most important thing. It's now more important where it is generated and when exactly it's generated. And some of the new policies are introducing these things. The auction scheme in Mexico, for instance, just introduced exactly this. It's based on certain additional incentives. If you build power plants, if you enter to an auction, if you choose a location of the power plant, you get an incentive because the value of electricity is higher there when you look at the overall system rather than somewhere else. And there are also very cheap technologies in place currently which is not used, like a demand-side response, which is used in only certain countries, which require certain policies and market design mechanisms to exploit them, which is unexploited in many parts of the world, except few countries. And obviously, using the interconnections more efficiently is very, very important. This is why you see Denmark number there. Denmark has important grid connections between different regions. The most striking one is not Denmark, it's actually Ireland, which is close, and it reaches in 2022 about 40% of almost just wind. So it is becoming more. And then, and it's also renewable industry or wind and solar industry is also well aware of this because they are changing also their technologies to address the variability, their forecast technologies, because right now in many countries they are not responsible for balancing. The grid will take whatever they produce. But in the next phase, they will be responsible for it, which means that they will have to manage their output in such a way that is friendly to the grid, which is already starting.
So I think the phrase is, may the wind always be at your back. Never mind. The market, the natural market for renewables, to the extent that there is one, there are a couple of takeaways I had from your presentation. It's easy to just sort of, at the start, say solar, solar, solar. And it's not hard to notice that the places that had the really low auction prices were kind of sunny. And there's probably a linkage there. But you also noted that there are limits to the size of the markets where efficiency was playing a big role. The government policy, because of load being essentially flat, was creating barriers. So in essence, can you characterize, are there some characteristics you can point to of sort of the best renewables markets?
So the characterize the best renewables market, I think is the limit is demand, but at the same time there is also you need to retire certain power plants in the coming years. So in Europe, there are a lot of retirements. So European markets are different, but you have UK, which will retire a lot of capacity. That's why it has to procure more additional new capacity, which is they are doing with renewables and also nuclear, for instance. So the efficiency is actually contributing to, in this case, to decarbonisation. They are hand in hand going together with renewables. So we always try to look at them together. But I will say the best market for renewables are those who have a long-term target, which basically has a long-term renewable target that the government is basically wants to achieve, combined with a policy that is also looking at this long-term target, which means that, okay, let's open a competition. We have to achieve this. And in order to get there, we need to announce this amount of capacity or energy to be delivered. In some countries, it's capacity. In some countries, is electricity delivered. So which needs to be, in my opinion, combined with policies that reflect the value of electricity. This will be the combination, a long-term target, a long-term contract system, because you are also talking about a different technology here. It's not like a coal or gas plant that building it is cheap, running it is expensive. Not expensive, meaning that you have to pay to run it. This one has all costs upfront. Running it is almost zero. So you have a different investment profile there, which you have to take into account. If you are putting all renewables in a marginal cost wholesale market, it's just not the same thing that the market is designed for. You have to have a different market that reflects their value, and I think the policy should take into account these futures and give long-term contrast signals to renewables to attract the investment, and give short-term signals to balance the market, but in such a way that it takes into account the value of electricity.
So in essence, I guess you're saying that some renewables are much like bonds. And you sort of make the upfront payment, and then the coupon pays out, and you need a market design that looks at that. I want to ask sort of a controversial question as my last question. Renewables, good, other things criticized, but as renewables grow into maturity and their profile grows, externalities and issues that surround renewables grow too. You mentioned trade, for example. China having a concentration of PV fab capacity makes sort of anti-China policy, anti-solar policy in some cases, and we're seeing, as you noted, some degree of that here. There's also the biomass, which you mentioned primarily in the context of heat, but which remains a big part also of renewable generation in many places, comes with emissions, whether or not they're greenhouse gas emissions. Every children's book from I guess, the Giving Tree to the Lorax gets into sort of the problems with cutting down trees and I suppose burning them. To what extent does the growth of renewables create, is uncertainty rising because as renewables grow into maturity, they're bringing these peripheral trade and environmental external issues into the mix?
Very important question. It's very early, but it will come, obviously. Let's start with electricity technologies, right? We have all these panels, millions of them. We estimated that there are 1,000 panels that will be built in the coming 5 years per minute. So every minute there will be 1,000 new panels that will be built to support our forecast, basically. So this is obviously a large amount of recycling because they last 25 years, right? Wind turbines last 25 years to 30 years. There will be a lot of recycling going through, and some of the policies have started to address those, especially for wind projects. In order to build a wind project in some countries, you need to take into account the decommissioning cost and the recycling cost. So this is something important. And for PV as well, of course, the energy that is basically spent to produce those PV panels, take into account. One of our analysts made an analysis that I think in next year or so it will make up for its energy consumed. What is it producing in terms of the, I don't remember the numbers right now, but it's kind of
the payback period.
The payback, exactly. So
and there's been studies that are anywhere from 1 to 3 years of a 20-year life could be energy cost payback, but that should decline with efficiency of manufacturing.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. And the part on the biomass, obviously, there's a sustainability question of biomass, which is a big discussion, but policies have a role to play here, obviously. I mean, sustainability measures, international sustainability measures of biomass have been around for a very long time, and it is actually used in the European Union or in other places. If you want to import wood pallets, you have certain certification that you need to, sustainability certification that you have to meet in order to get those wood pallets mainly from Canada to European Union. So it's kind of a policy question here as well. Again, we are asking a policy question, how policies can address this challenge. And there are already successful examples of these policies which can be implemented elsewhere. Obviously in Asia, there are sustainability issues that we have been reading on the newspapers. I think these policies should come to that part. And China, I will say, is entering into the picture very fast. They just increased their biomass for power capacity just last week. So when China increases its target, which means it's a lot of additional biomass resources that are required, obviously also requires a policy attention.
Thank you. Thanks for those answers. So I'm going to turn it over to the crowd. There are a couple of requests. First, please raise your hand for the microphone because this is being webcast and that's the only way people out there will hear you. Second, please identify yourself. And third, to the maximum extent practicable, please try to ask a question. Who'd like to go first? Any takers? All right, so we've driven them into submission. Maybe I should ask an easy question and lower the bar here a little bit. Maybe those were too intellectual. Where's the backlash against renewables? I mean, in every economic movement, there's usually a counter movement. Incumbents tend to be threatened. Are we seeing that anywhere in the world in a significant way? I mean, we feed in tariffs, have a cost. There are incumbent generators that have problems with net energy metering in some markets. But is this showing up on the screen yet? Is this one of the risks you think about?
Yes, it is. It is a risk. It is happening in Europe. Many large-scale utilities have seen their revenues decline due to the increasing penetration of renewables, gas plants, for instance. And some of the very efficient gas plants in Germany retired very early because of this a couple of years ago. So there is an impact on this policy. There are, I think, two aspects. One is on the utility scale project side, like large gas existing assets. What's going to happen to existing assets? The same problem for coal in China as well. They are running less and less in certain regions. And obviously, this is an issue because revenues decrease. So there should be a policy because many countries actually need that flexible generation, especially I'm talking about for gas. So there are several policies to keep those generators in. You can design auctions in such a way that those generators also get remunerated what value they provide to the system in moments where we need their generation. It's actually very important to have them.
You're touching on a topic that's very current here in Washington. I don't know if you were aware of that.
No.
The resiliency value
energy
of certain
security.
energy. Yes. Please go.
Yeah. So it is obviously important to keep them or building new flexible power plants to be able to manage the increasing share of renewables. This is on the utility side. The distributed side is even more complicated because there you have grid charges. In most of the countries, as you know, if you look at your bill, you pay a fixed price, probably only 10% of your bill. Anything that you pay after, energy, grid, charges, whatever you can think is variable. It's by energy consumed. So it's usually all around the world is the same. I didn't show that slide, but we look at in several countries right now, the variable part of your electricity bill is actually higher than if you put your solar PV panels on your roof, when you look at the levelized cost of energy. So this doesn't necessarily mean that you will immediately put them. There are other factors that you need to take into account. But obviously, it is changing a lot, the utilities perspective. But there's also one important note. I think there's also the new era coming up on that utilities are not only anymore, will not only be a billing company, which means they provide you the secure energy and send you a bill. They are becoming, in the US and Europe, a service company, which means that you are actually becoming a utility where there's providing you the smart meters with energy efficiency improvements, combined with demand response, which will help grid integration in the electronic way. You will be able to see the real price of electricity when it is generated, and this will be included. So in Europe, for instance, many big utilities have separate companies right now providing these services and generating additional revenues, combining renewables, solar PV especially, with heating systems, renewable heating systems, and energy efficiency measures to provide a value to you, saying that, okay, you pay this much in your electricity bill. If we do this system, your electricity bill will be reduced by this combination of PV, storage, heat pumps, efficiency, and so on and so forth. I think we will see a change, and I think utilities understood that this will change, and it will be the next phase of utilities probably, that they will provide these services, and it will not be only sending you the bill and changing, they will provide actually services in addition to what they've been doing. Yeah.
That's an apt point. We have a question over there. Liam, would you like to?
Hi, I'm Liam Stone. I'm with the Government of Alberta, Canada at the Canadian Embassy. It seems like a lot of the U.S. policy debate hinges around jobs. And if you sort of project out along the lines of what you've analyzed here in terms of renewable penetration across the regions, is there a commensurate shift in where jobs associated with our energy systems move? If significant manufacturing is taking place in China or Asia broadly relative to, coal or natural gas generation in the U.S. or other developed countries, is there a change in the jobs picture that could, I think, go to Kevin's question about the politics of renewables going forward?
So we did not estimate job creation. It's a very, very difficult task. Some of other institutions did that. We did not enter into that field yet, so I cannot answer your question quantitatively in this case. But there are several estimations by IRENA, International Renewable Energy Association, about not relative to coal and gas, but mostly on the renewables side. These are different jobs, of course, than coal and gas jobs. And it includes engineering. It includes simple installation so going back to solar PV, we are talking about a technology that can be installed at a level of 8 watts to 1 gigawatt, basically. So jobs spectrum within this is pretty large, in my opinion, in this case. So I think jobs, this is a personal opinion without looking at any numbers, but if you are looking at if we are saying that 2/3 of new capacity additions in electricity will come from renewables in the next 5 years, this is the quantitative number I have, which means that new jobs, to build those, to create the supply for those, I will think that will be on renewable side. This is a personal opinion, just the number in terms of capacity.
I mean, the labor intensity multipliers are pretty well established. You have a significantly higher job intensity per BTU in renewables. It's the character of the jobs that is often debated, and this gets to some of the manufacturing versus installation continuum. Very large project engineering is a skill set, but very small project installation is a different skill set, and the economic value that comes off of a construction job is different from the economic value that comes off of a manufacturing job. To the extent that we're in the United States importing a lot of our PV technology, we are creating a lot of jobs by having the technology to install that we otherwise wouldn't have, which is, I think, a point you would make. But the jobs we're creating aren't the same as some of the jobs associated with the creation of the technology. Did I see another question over on this side of the room? Yes.
Yes, Benjamin Xu from Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, or TECRO in short. My question is related with the current administration's policy. Since President Trump came into office, we see that he relaxed some regulations on the energy sector. For example, he encouraged the export of liquefied natural gas, and also we saw the coal productions in certain states also increase. So does that will that affect your forecast on the renewables, or have you factored in your forecast? And how did you do that? Thank you.
So thanks for the question. So the forecast basically looks at the policies that exist today on renewables. So which means that tax incentives, renewable portfolio standards, and state-level incentives for distributed generation. These are the three major policies, and there's a fourth one state-level tax incentives for utility-scale generation. There is a sub-additional ones, the corporate companies in the corporations in the United States. They are basically, according to their strategy, they are either developing wind plants or buying, agreeing long-term agreements with those wind or solar plants. That's another one. These are the drivers that we look at. We look at the not state by state, but in certain regions, important parts of the US, basically on renewables, and basically trying to see where the market will grow, and with these drivers. And these drivers, if they don't change, they remain strong to basically deploy renewables in the United States. That's one important thing. The second one, related to clean power plant, for instance. You talked about several regulations that are being set. So clean power plant starts 2022. I mean, after 22 it started. If it starts, it will not, according to many. But obviously, it's not affecting our forecast that much. But it's obvious that if you don't have regulations to control the pollution, you don't have a carbon price, you don't have additional incentives when federal tax incentive phase out, obviously the economics will change. And if the economics change over the longer term, in the absence of these policies, you will expect that the fossil fuel generation may actually increase in the United States. It's in terms of calculation, because renewable policies are phasing out, federal tax credit, which are very important. If there is nothing to basically incentivize them, I'm not saying additional tax incentive, any other policy that incentivizing them. And on the other hand, you have no policies pricing externalities of fossil fuels, then of course the picture may change indeed.
I think I just want to highlight two important points that you made. The first of these is the durability of state policies. Of course, in the US in particular, a lot of the renewables demand, Heymi mentioned, is generated by state renewable portfolio standards, which are not a function of polarities in Washington. And in some cases, it may be that the polarity shift in Washington may accelerate responses at the state level that otherwise might not have happened. So there could even be sort of a rollback rebound, if you want. The second point he made in his presentation that I think is easy to overlook is the impact of tax reform on tax equity demand for renewables. So the essence of this is that one of the attributes that drives renewable installation in the US, much like the feed-in tariffs in Europe, gave levered rates of return in the double digits with perfect security to investors. And so people bought solar power in Germany, but they were really buying return, and the solar power was an extra. In the same way, the tax equity market functions to provide, yes, an incentive to renewable power, but a shelter to corporate tax exposure. So in the context of successful tax reform, which per his rule, the policy hasn't changed yet, but if there were to be a tax reform that reduced corporate exposure, it could have a negative impact on the demand for tax equity. If there are no PTCs and no ITCs to transfer, then of course tax equity disappears. I am somewhat skeptical that subsidies and incentives that are politically popular disappear forever so soon, but that is currently the law. So if you were to model it by that rule, that would be your answer. So I think two very good points. We have three more questions. We'll start in the center, and based on time, we have probably, this will be a round of three, and we'll see if we can get to more. So starting with you, please.
Thank you. Joniel Cha, I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University at CSIS, so great to meet a fellow CSISer. A couple of my professors in the ERE department expressed concern about some conservative, predictions regarding the renewable potential in the next 5 years, as the report indicates. And as you may be aware, there's a famous graph that depicts the IEA's predictions relative to the actual renewable growth. And there were examples of reductions in technology costs and other factors that you mentioned, such as the auction bidding. Like in Saudi Arabia, the solar capacity bid went down to about 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour, and then in India it went down to about 4 cents per kilowatt hour for wind capacity. So my question is, what would you have me report back to my concerned professors regarding the forecasting? And obviously this is a difficult thing to do, and so I commend you for your efforts. And Professor Sappho's expressly recommended that I attend your presentation, so I'm very grateful. But there are a couple other professors who expressed this concern, so thank you.
We get 3 questions?
No, we can take that one on.
Okay. So the famous question, why IEA is so conservative on renewables, right? So let's differentiate between forecast and scenarios here, okay? I think it's important to differentiate them. Many people who are basically saying IEA is conservative, is giving the World Energy Outlook projections going to 2040. I'd like to emphasize one important point. These scenarios are based on existing policies. So, and if the existing policies give the indication of renewable markets in several countries that way, our projections will take that into account. IEA's role is to inform policymakers about if you have these policies, you go towards that direction. If you change those policies, you can go higher. That's why there is the 450 scenario that is World Energy Outlook is producing. So let's just look at very quickly what happened in just 2 years. Like I'm trying to emphasize how dynamic is this market. So China installed about 15 gigawatts of solar in 2015. It installed 35 gigawatt in 2016 in 1 year. So no one, including us, were not expecting this kind of big jump. On the other hand, the government introduces capacity targets which are, compared to this growth, is very low. This is the policy that is going on. So that's why I'm trying to say that the policies are changing fast. That's why our scenario analysis, every year you will see that it will change. Normally, this is pretty much the trend. And as we say, for the long term, we hope we are wrong again in the long-term scenario, because which means that policies are changing to address those policy highlights that we are making. IEA has been extremely vocal, which is its role, saying that if you have these policies, you will not get there. This is IEA's role to say it. This is the long-term part. And on the forecast side, exactly to reflect this uncertainty, policy uncertainty in the short term, we are basically giving 2 forecasts. One is the main case forecast or base case forecast. The other one is an accelerated forecast. That's why I presented them side by side in each region. And you see the upside. Upside is almost 30% more. I think it is important, even if you do the forecast, to reflect the uncertainty that is around it. It's very fair to do this. I think it's actually gives you an idea of which direction the world can go. Last year, in 2015 again, I'll give you another example in China. China deployed 32 gigawatts of wind power. Okay? In 2016, it deployed less than 20, a decline. No one talks about it because it's the era of solar. No one talked about this decline like it was not basically told that much, but it's a reality. And the reason why was policy. And just one information, our last year's report predicted this exactly, that will happen on spot. So I'm not saying that we were right in every single thing. Of course, as I said, very honestly, it's in the report, by the way, in the introduction section, that we did not, our main case missed the global solar PV additions in 2016, but our accelerated case was exactly on spot again. So that's why I'm trying to present both at the same time. And I raised a very important policy uncertainty in the shift from feed-in tariffs. I'm talking about China because whatever China does affects the global trend. So that's why we are raising, again, a policy uncertainty in the main case to shift from feed-in tariffs to green certificate system, which timing and implementation is not defined yet already. So our forecast, again, reflects this uncertainty. Sorry, it was a long answer, but I just want to give examples on how we do our forecast. Yeah.
So just to add on to that very briefly, to be right as an analyst is very hard, but I can teach you how to be wrong in only 9 words. Yeah. I've given this presentation before. There's three chapters. Chapter 1 is significant government control. Chapter 2 is limited data quality, and Chapter 3 is long infrastructure life. With those 9 words, you can be wrong almost every time. But the first one is really a biggie. Yeah. Bill, you had a question in the back.
Bill Eichert, consultant. Just a question about what's in the forecast period here, and specifically about technological developments. And if you answered this already, I apologize, I had to step out for a minute. But so I'm particularly interested in knowing whether, especially perhaps in the advanced case or you know the additional case, whether you factored in any technological developments. I'm thinking about things like we had a presentation here at CSIS a few weeks ago about floating offshore wind. Which is really kind of an interesting new technology, but also then to the degree that new system integration technologies are coming along every day, and and it's conceivable that during the forecast period that some of those could be adopted in some economies. So, you know, how about that, and how about perhaps longer range battery technologies, storage technologies?
So, just want to stand up. I have a slide to show on this. Can I still change it?
Yeah. Use that microphone up there.
How technologies is changing. So these are the additional slides. Actually, I will start from offshore wind. So this is the what's happening in offshore wind. So this is the star of, obviously, in the coming years, onshore wind and solar PV, but there are 2 technologies which will achieve incredible cost reductions, which is factored in our forecast, but also these are large-scale projects. So again, the infrastructure dilemma is very high on them. So what is going on in offshore wind in Europe is actually a revolution. So there's a big step change, as you can see. For projects, these are the auction results of projects that will come online that came online in 2013 and will come online over the coming 10 years. So you see that it's not divided by half, by 3 times, 4 times. And actually, an offshore wind contract in Germany accepted, which will come online in 2025, it's mentioned there at 60 euros, but it's actually no subsidy contract. They bid 0. This is our estimation of the wholesale price, the developer's estimation of wholesale price. So what is going to happen? We looked at the project by project of these offshore wind plants, and then see an incredible change of the turbine size, which means that currently the average installed turbine on the sea is about 3 to 4 megawatts. In 2022, average turbine size will be 10 megawatts. What does this mean? This means that you have less foundations to install, which means you have less operation and maintenance, you have less construction costs, you have less cement, you have less of everything. And these turbines can actually produce up to 50 to 55% capacity factor. It's like these are large infrastructure projects, and their project size is growing. So this is the reality that we expect. But in our forecast, we have an accelerated case on offshore wind, but it's still small because the lead times of these projects are higher. That's the one reason. So the time scale is limiting us, exactly. But we showed in the book that it's coming up very fast. We are talking about merging in just 4 countries, the cost around 60 euros, which means about $75 now, $70, $75, something like this, which is very, very competitive compared to other technologies. The other one is CSP, concentrated solar power. So here you see on the right-hand side of the chart, on my right or left-hand side of the figure, you see that the project sizes, the bubbles are growing, and their storage levels are increasing to about 15 to sometimes 16, 18 hours. So which means that we will see more in obviously sunny places that solar PV sometimes combined with CSP or not, but CSP has actually a great storage facility that can be seen here that is very large, and this is one of the technologies that we are expecting to basically enter into the market, CSP and offshore wind. That's the two technologies. On the large scale battery side, still very expensive compared to pump hydro, which is growing very fast, which is a very cheap way of, like relatively cheap way of storing. But beyond 5 years, obviously, we will see more and more, if the market design allows, these kind of storage technologies to come into play.
Okay, our last question is right up here.
Hi, I'm Michelle Bowman with EIA. I had 2 quick questions, hopefully. What impact do you think the Suniva trade case will have on the PV market globally? And I was curious how IEA models, or if you consider repowering or retiring solar and wind plants, and what assumptions do you make about that?
So the first question is the trade case in US, right, if I understood correctly. So the calculation is simple in this case. I mean, it's US has 1.2 gigawatts of manufacturing capacity of solar PV panels, modules or cells, you can call it. The demand in the US, local demand, is 14 gigawatts. Last year, probably it will be a little bit lower this year, but it will be around, let's say, 13, 14 gigawatts in the coming 5 years. So just to talk about numbers, if there is an import tariff on solar PV panels coming to US, the price is going to increase in the short term, for sure. And on top of this, US is one of the highest system cost market in the world, by the way, in terms of the utility scale projects, because of the balance of system cost, different financing mechanisms, and so on and so forth. It's actually expensive already in the US, both utility scale and residential, compared to other advanced markets. So the price will obviously go up. It depends how much local manufacturing capacity will have appetite to basically build up this. That's one question. The other one, some of the US manufacturers have actually production capacity in Asia. So depends how the import tariff is designed, or if it is designed, or if it's approved by the president. We do not know yet. But the global implication will be somehow limited because of this demand-supply balance in the United States. The United States doesn't have any effect on the supply at this point, and it will be very difficult that it will have very quickly. Maybe in the longer term, the picture will change completely, but in the short term, 2-3 years, it will be very, very difficult to manage that capacity, to build up, to have a global impact. And these trade cases are not new. Europe did that to China. India opened the filed the case against China. China filed the case against India and Europe. I mean, these are, over the last 5 years, these are very famous examples of cases. The market somehow finds a way to go somewhere else. So what happened in the European trade case, the capacity moved from China to Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, Taiwan. So it got exported from there. So in a global trade environment, it's a bit difficult to manage those. Depends on how you design the policy, obviously. For the retirements, we have a lifetime, economic lifetime. We have a technical lifetime assumption. We have an economic lifetime assumption. We also track the places where retirements are actually announced, like Germany, like you can actually get the real data on the retirements. For instance, the biggest uncertainty in Germany's cumulative capacity is how the retirements are treated, because the new policy invites both projects that are existing to bid in the auctions and the new projects, depending on the location and your status. So it was very difficult for us to do the Germany forecast, particularly because of this, because we do not know if these will be new projects or this will be the retirement projects and so on and so forth. So there are two things that we do not model, which we should, but it's very tough. The first thing is that when a wind plant retires, this is more difficult for wind than solar. When a wind plant retires, can you actually put larger turbines in that same site? Are you allowed to? In many places, you are not allowed to because you don't have construction permit to do so. So does this actually increase automatically the capacity of that plant, net capacity? We do not know. That's why it is very, very difficult to treat the retirements. We are lucky because we are looking at 5-year terms, but in our longer term assumptions, it will be more or less based on the economic lifetime because we do not have that much of information to process that.
Thank you. Just a minor add-on by way of information. The green trade war is underway, pretty much an expected result of the world spending $500 billion in stimulus money on green energy alone in 2009. So I think it's a very good question. We probably haven't seen the last of this. And the identity of the U.S. renewables policy has been changing slowly. It was originally a consumption-based policy to diversify the grid, but it was repurposed in the recovery as a policy to generate jobs and to create manufacturing and global competitiveness. That's not an easy transition to make, but tariffs may be part of that transition. We're a little over time, so I'm afraid we'll have to stop questions here, but I wanted to ask you all to join me in thanking our guest, and thank you very much for a terrific job.